Hi guys, welcome back to In Case of Econ Struggles. Today we're talking about the Phillips curve, and the Phillips curve just relates GDP or output to inflation. So in this very simple example, I have pi, which stands for inflation rather than profit. I've got some parameter k that's greater than 0, and I've got y, which is the output or GDP. Notice this is big Y, so this is actual output. You'll see why that matters in a second. Now we've got this simple Phillips curve that I just talked about, but the Phillips curve comes in many other flavors, specifically two other types of flavors that you might see in macro models. The first main flavor is called an Expectations Augmented Phillips Curve. There are two main Phillips curves of this variety, the old Keynesian Phillips Curve and the new Keynesian Phillips Curve. We'll talk about those in detail in a second. We also have a third flavor of a Phillips curve which relates inflation to unemployment rather than output. So again, we'll talk about this more in detail, but here's a sample equation of an unemployment Phillips curve. And we'll start off with the Expectations Augmented Phillips Curve, specifically the old Keynesian Expectations Augmented Phillips Curve. Here is our equation. We've got inflation today. It's based on two things. It's based on that KYT that we saw earlier, but notice that this Y is now a little y. The reason it's a little y is because this is now what we call the output gap. The output gap is just the actual level of output, or the actual GDP, minus what we call the natural rate of output, or Y star. So when you take the difference of the actual level of output and the natural rate of output, you get this little y. We have that same positive K in front of it. Now this expectation is something that I'm going to talk a little more about. Notice that this is E sub t minus 1 of pi t. So this is yesterday's best guess of what inflation will be today. And the way this factors into the Phillips curve is that, well, if people generally yesterday think that inflation today is going to be higher, then lo and behold, inflation today will be higher. Put another way, inflation tomorrow will be higher if people today think inflation tomorrow will be higher. So you can think of it as, well, at the end of COVID, when inflation started going up, people today probably thought inflation tomorrow would also still be high, and because of those expectations, when we got to the next period, or got to tomorrow, people's expectation helped boost inflation, or made it higher than it would otherwise would have been. Slightly different, but still similar to the old Keynesian Phillips curve, is the new Keynesian Phillips curve. So notice it looks very similar, except for this expectations part. Now, instead of t minus 1 and t, we have t and t plus 1. So what this represents is, this is people's expectation today of inflation tomorrow. This would say, okay, well, if people today think inflation tomorrow will be higher, then inflation today will be higher, rather than saying inflation tomorrow will be higher. So old Keynesian Phillips curve would tell you that, well, if I expect inflation to be high tomorrow, that should impact inflation tomorrow. New Keynesians think that if you expect inflation to be higher tomorrow, inflation today will be higher because of those expectations. So that's the main difference between the old Keynesian and new Keynesian Phillips curve. The third main flavor of a Phillips curve is an unemployment Phillips curve, or what I call an unemployment Phillips curve. Notice that this looks like the old Keynesian Phillips curve with our ET minus 1 of pi t, but now we have this function h of ut minus u bar. All ut is the unemployment rate today. U bar is the natural rate of unemployment. So we just take the difference and we subtract that from inflation. Notice again, I've just used this old Keynesian version of the expectations. That doesn't really matter. You could have used the new Keynesian version where it's ET of pi t plus 1. The main thing that I want to get out of this type of Phillips curve is that unemployment is here with this function h, which makes sense because unemployment and output are very closely related. So if I can put KYT, it makes sense that I could also put in some function of unemployment here. Just to make sure we're clear on the concept, if we're in a recession, then I would expect unemployment to go up, which would mean the difference between unemployment and U bar would go up and be positive. If that is positive, I'm subtracting a positive number from inflation, so inflation goes down. If I'm in a boom, then my unemployment goes down, and it might be that unemployment is below the natural rate of output because the unemployment rate today would be lower than the natural rate of unemployment. Hopefully this gives you an overview of the three main types of Phillips curves and how to interpret them. If this was helpful, make sure to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time for another case of Econ Struggles.